Let me tell you something that happened to a friend of mine. At first, the question was simple. What was being investigated? That was the first thing he needed to understand, because when an investigation opens, especially one involving a child, words matter. Dates matter. Timeframes matter. The reason for the investigation matters. And when an agency becomes involved in someone's family, the process is supposed to have structure. There is supposed to be a beginning. There is supposed to be a reason. There is supposed to be a timeline. And there is supposed to be an explanation for what is happening. But in this case, the more he asked for clarity, the less clear the process became. He was told the case was opened for investigation purposes. He was also told the investigation had concluded. Those two things by themselves might not sound unusual. An investigation opens. An investigation concludes. That is what is supposed to happen. But then another question appeared. If the investigation had concluded, why did parts of it still seem active? Why were restrictions still being referenced? Why was a safety concern still being implied? Why was there still a process happening after the point where he had been told the investigation was over? So he did what anyone trying to understand the process would do. He asked, not emotionally, not dramatically, not with accusations. He asked for procedural clarification. He asked for the documented reason the investigation extended beyond the standard time frame. He asked for the date any extension was requested. He asked who approved it. He asked whether the extension was granted before or after the investigation was determined to be concluded. And he asked what authority was relied upon to extend it. Those are not complicated questions. Those are process questions. They do not require opinion. They do not require anyone to take sides. They are simple administrative questions. If a case was extended, there should be a reason. If there was a reason, it should have a date. If there was an approval, there should be a supervisor. If the process was followed, the process should be explainable, but the written answer did not come. So he followed up. Again, he asked for clarification. Again, he asked for the basis of the timeline. Again, he asked for the reason the investigation appeared to extend past the point where it had already been described as concluded. And again, the central questions remained unanswered. That is where the story changes. Because now the issue is no longer only the original incident, it becomes the process itself. It becomes how a case can be described as concluded while still creating consequences. It becomes how a safety concern can remain active without the written basis being provided. It becomes how a parent can be expected to respond to a process that he cannot fully see. And that matters, because when a process affects access to a child, it cannot be vague. When a process affects someone's ability to understand what they are being accused of, it cannot be unclear. When a process creates restrictions, obligations, or expectations, it cannot exist only as a reference. It has to be documented. It has to be explainable. And if it cannot be explained, then the absence of that explanation becomes part of the record too. That is one of the most important parts of this story. Not everything important is found in what was produced. Sometimes the most important part is what was asked for repeatedly and never answered. So the question was no longer simply, what happened? The question became, what process was followed after it happened? And more specifically, was the process documented? Because if the case was extended, there should be a document. If the investigation continued, there should be a documented reason. If a supervisor approved it, there should be a name. If a safety plan remained relevant, there should be a basis. And if none of that can be provided in writing, then the process itself becomes unclear. Not because of speculation, not because of emotion, because the written record does not answer the questions. And that is what he was left with. A case that had been described as concluded. Questions about why it continued. A safety plan being referenced, and no written explanation that resolved the timeline. So the next question became even more serious. If the timeline could not be clearly explained, what else was being treated as established without being shown? Let me tell you something that happened to a friend of mine. Months after the first reports, after the filings, after the restrictions, after the request for documents, another report appeared. But this one was different. This one was not classified the same way as the original report. It was not classified the same way as the second report. It carried a new label. Mental health call. That is what the document says. And that matters. Because once a report is labeled that way, it changes the lens. It changes how someone reading it understands the person involved. It changes how future documents may be interpreted. It changes the way the story feels before anyone even reads the details. A classification can do that. A label can do that. Because before the facts are even examined, the category has already started shaping the reader's expectations. And in this case, the timing is important. This report did not appear at the beginning. It appeared months later, after there had already been court filings, after there had already been concerns raised, after there had already been references to behavior, safety, and mental health. So when a later report is classified as a mental health call, it does not exist in a vacuum. It becomes part of a larger pattern of documentation. Not because we are guessing, not because we are adding anything, because the record itself now contains multiple labels across multiple documents created at different points in time. And each label matters. First, there was a report with one classification, then another report with a different classification, then court filings with a narrative attached, then months later, another report using mental health language. That sequence matters because it shows how the frame around the person changed over time. And once that frame changes, it becomes difficult to separate what actually happened from how it was later categorized. That is the danger of labels. They can outlive the facts that created them. A label can remain in a record. A classification can be repeated. A category can travel. And when someone is trying to challenge or clarify the record, they are no longer only responding to one event. They are responding to an image that has been built across documents. That is what makes this report important. Not because the title alone proves anything. It does not. A report title is not a diagnosis. A report classification is not a medical finding. A police entry is not the same as a clinical evaluation. But when the report uses mental health framing, and that framing appears after other documents already use similar concern-based language, it becomes part of the documented timeline. And the timeline is the story, not emotion, not interpretation, the timeline. The first report documented one thing. The second report documented another. The court filings framed the situation in a particular way. Then this report added another classification, mental health call. And now the question becomes, what was verified? That is the question that has to stay at the center of every episode. What was claimed? What was documented? What was verified? Because those are not the same things. A claim can be written. A report can be created. A classification can be assigned. But verification is different. Verification requires support. Verification requires documentation beyond the label. Verification requires something that can be pointed to. And that is why this moment matters. Because by the time this report appears, the story is no longer just about a single day. It is about how a person was being documented over time. It is about how language changes. It is about how one classification can become another. It is about how a narrative can move from incident to concern, to restriction, to mental health framing. And once the record starts moving that way, the burden becomes heavier. Because every new label carries the weight of the last one. Every new report sits on top of the documents before it. And every unanswered question becomes harder to ignore. So the real question is not whether this report exists. It does. The real question is what supported the classification? What made it a mental health call? What was independently verified? What was documented beyond the label? And what was simply carried forward from the narrative that had already been created? Because if a label can be added months later, then the next thing to examine is the court record itself. Not what people believed, not what people felt, what the court record actually shows. Let me tell you something that happened to a friend of mine. There is a difference between what people say happened and what the court record shows happened. That difference matters because the court record is not supposed to be memory. It is not supposed to be opinion. It is not supposed to be someone's version of a conversation. It is the timeline. It is the official sequence of filings, hearings, orders, and events. And when a story becomes complicated, the docket becomes important. Because the docket does not explain everything, but it shows when things entered the system. It shows what was filed. It shows when hearings were scheduled. It shows when orders were issued, and sometimes the timing tells its own story. In this case, the court record begins long before the incident. The divorce case existed years earlier. There was already a legal framework. There was already a custody and parenting time history. There had already been prior court activity. So when everything changed in November 2025, it did not happen inside an empty file. It happened inside a case that already existed. That is important, because it means the emergency motion did not create the family history. It entered an existing one, and once that motion was filed, the sequence moved quickly. The court record shows an emergency motion regarding parenting time. It shows a request to suspend parenting time. It shows references to therapeutic counseling and psychological evaluation. Then shortly after, the record shows an ex parte order suspending parenting time. That is a major action, not a minor note, not an administrative update, a suspension of parenting time. And when parenting time is suspended, the impact is immediate. Communication changes, access changes, the relationship changes, the parent-child dynamic changes, and all of that begins to happen because of what has been placed before the court. That is why the earlier documents matter, because court action does not happen in isolation. It is based on what is presented. It is based on what is filed. It is based on the narrative and documentation available at that moment. So the question becomes, what was before the court when the order was issued? What documents existed? What reports existed? What claims were made? What was verified? And what had not yet been produced? That is where the tension lives. Not in arguing with the court record. The court record is the court record. The tension is in the timing, because the docket shows when the emergency motion entered the case. It shows when the ex parte order was issued. It shows when hearings were scheduled. It shows when later orders followed. But the docket itself does not answer whether every underlying claim had been independently verified. At the time decisions were made, that is not speculation. That is the next question created by the record. The court record shows action. The other documents show the material surrounding that action. And when you place them next to each other, the question becomes unavoidable. Were decisions made before all supporting documentation was produced? Because if a parent is told not to have contact, where is the order? If a trespass is referenced, where is the trespass document? If a safety plan is treated as active, where is the written plan? If a report is referenced, where is the report? Those questions matter because the docket shows consequences. It shows the machinery moving. It shows the legal process taking shape. But the documents surrounding that process show something else. Requests, clarifications, missing records, unanswered procedural questions. And that combination is the heart of this episode. The court record does not need to be dramatic. It is dramatic because of what it means. A motion was filed, an order was issued, parenting time was suspended, a hearing was scheduled. Later proceedings were set. That is the official path. But beneath that path are the documents he kept asking for. The records he asked to see, the basis he asked to understand, the written explanations that did not come. So when people say, "What happened?" the answer is not one sentence. The answer is a timeline. And the timeline shows something very specific. First, records were created. Then claims were made. Then court action followed. Then requests for documentation continued. And some of the most important questions still remained unanswered. That is why the docket matters. Because it locks the sequence into place. It shows what happened procedurally. It shows when the case moved. And once the timeline is visible, the next question becomes, what was missing when the decisions were made? Because sometimes the most important part of a court record is not only what appears in it, it is what had not yet been produced when the record started changing someone's life. Source basis, CPS procedural emails and written requests for clarification. Let me tell you something that happened to a friend of mine. At a certain point, he stopped asking people to agree with him. He stopped trying to explain how he felt. He stopped trying to argue the story emotionally, and he started asking for documents. That is when the story became simple, not easy, simple. Because once you ask for documents, the issue becomes very clear. Either the record exists or it does not. Either the process can be explained or it cannot. Either there is a written basis or there is not. And that is what this episode is about. Everything he asked for, and everything that was not answered. He asked for the reason the CPS investigation extended beyond the standard time frame. That was one question, not an accusation, a question. If the investigation went beyond the normal period, what was the documented reason? He asked when the extension was requested. That was another question. If there was an extension, there should be a date. He asked who approved it. If a supervisor approved the extension, there should be a name. He asked whether the extension was granted before or after the investigation was described as concluded. That is not complicated. That is timeline clarification. He asked what authority was relied upon to grant the extension. Again, not emotional. Procedural. He asked for the basis of the safety plan. Because if a safety plan affects access, conduct, communication, or restrictions, then the basis matters. He asked what the safety plan was supposed to do. He asked why it was being referenced as though there was still an active concern. He asked for the supervisor's contact information. He asked for clarification. He asked for records. He asked for written answers. And again, the key questions were not answered in the way they were asked. That is the pattern. Not one unanswered question, a series of unanswered questions. And that is where the weight builds. Because one unanswered question could be oversight, two could be delay. But when the same core questions remain unanswered across multiple requests, the absence itself becomes important. Not because it proves intent, it does not. Not because it proves wrongdoing. That is not the claim. It matters because the record shows the questions were asked, and the record does not show clear written answers to those questions. That is the distinction. This is not about guessing what someone meant. It is not about assuming why they did or did not respond. It is about what can be shown. The emails exist. The requests exist. The questions are written. The lack of direct answers becomes part of the documented story. And the reason this matters is because the unanswered questions were not minor. They were not random. They were not unrelated. They went to the center of the process. Why was the case extended? Who approved it? What was the basis of the safety plan? Was the investigation over or still active? What documentation supported the restrictions? Who had authority to impose them? Those are foundational questions. Because without those answers, a person cannot fully understand what process they are inside. And if they cannot understand the process, they cannot meaningfully respond to it. That is the point. Not outrage, not drama, process. Because when a system acts, the system should be able to explain the action. When a restriction is referenced, the document should be available. When a plan is mentioned, the plan should be produced. When a timeline changes, the reason should be recorded. When a supervisor approves something, that approval should be identifiable. And when none of that is clearly provided, the person affected is left with consequences instead of clarity. That is what happened here. He had consequences. He had restrictions. He had labels. He had reports. He had court filings. He had a process moving us around him, but when he asked for the basis, the answers did not match the weight of what was happening. So by the end of this part of the story, the central question had changed. It was no longer only what happened that day. It became what can actually be proven from the documents. Because claims were made, reports were created, orders were entered, requests were submitted, responses were received. But not every claim came with a document. Not every instruction came with an order. Not every concern came with a written basis. And not every question received an answer. That is where the story stands. Not in speculation, not in emotion. In the record, and in the spaces where the record should have answered, but didn't. So when someone asked what happened to his friend, the most honest answer is this: a lot was said. Some of it was documented, some of it was acted on. But when he asked for the documents behind the most serious parts, the answers were not there. And that is where the next part begins.